Story this morning about a lesson I learned from my dad about the power of being courageous. At the height of the Cold War, in the early 80s, my dad wrote a letter of conscience to his fellow architects, inviting them to join him in lifting up their voices collectively under the banner of peace and nuclear disarmament. He was a small business owner, just like most everybody here in the room. He had no particular standing in his community or in his industry, but he did have the strength of his conviction. That was motivated by a pretty profound fear that there wouldn't be a world for his kids to grow up in. And so out of that, he wrote this letter of conscience to his fellow architects, and almost immediately they responded to that call, and they co-founded an organization called Architects for Social Responsibility that went on to do tremendous work to build bridges between the US and the then Soviet Union, and to then create the opportunity for just business relationships that were based on relationships and not transactions, where ideology would break down and common humanity would flourish. 10 years ago, there was another group of small business leaders who didn't have any particular standing in their communities. They weren't necessarily out there on the cover of magazines or being feted with honors at the White House. But they had the power of their convictions to not only stand up, but to stand together to envision a better world for all of us. And they did one of the most powerful and inspiring things. They were inspired not only to act, but they were inspired to act together. And that's an awful lot harder to do. My dad wrote this little pamphlet of purpose, sort of the underpinnings behind his call to action for his profession of architecture. And there was a quote that led off that pamphlet that he was inspired by a very little known professor from the University of California, Santa Cruz. And there was a very simple yet profound idea in that quote, which said, "The future is an act of creation. First in our minds, then in our will, and then in action." And that very simple idea that we have the power to create the future that we want to see is what motivated that action, that act of courage from my father, and invited his peers to rally around that banner for peace and freedom. And it's what inspires me about these founding B corporations. 10 years ago, there was this nascent idea that would get us laughed out of business schools and mocked across the pond. But there was the strength of a conviction that was motivated by a similar fear, a fear that our world might be greatly diminished by rising insecurity, fear, exclusion, hate, violence, and the effects of climate change. And that fear was transformed into the courage to act. And not only to act individually through the power of their businesses, but to act collectively to form a community. And you all remind me of my mom for your willingness to be vulnerable and to be the first movers to help build a movement. Like that video that somebody talked about in yesterday's session about how to build a movement. The first guy's dancing all by himself, and it's a little bit weird. And then somebody else comes up and starts dancing with him. And then all of a sudden, before you know it, the entire community, the entire hillside is covered with people dancing and having a great time. But someone has to have that courage to be the first dancer. And you all had the courage to be vulnerable, right? To be laughed at, to be marginalized, to feel alone, and to be that first person. And so you remind me of my mom, and your willingness to be vulnerable. And you also remind me of my dad. because you had the courage to transform your fears for what the world might be into positive action and community to create the world we want. And so among the, as I've had a lot of time to think, I've worn a particular t-shirt that has become my sort of talisman for a difficult year. And it's my favorite tee. And it asks a very simple question. And I find that good questions are much more powerful than answers. And this t-shirt says, simply as a question, it says, what are you grateful for? And as I sat through sort of long days of chemo and long nights in silence by myself, I've had to ask that question a lot about what I'm grateful for. And among the things I am most grateful for is all of you. Because you've given me personally an opportunity to live into my highest aspiration, which is to be worthy of the gifts that I've been given, and to use ourselves, our relationships, and our businesses to, as the t-shirt says, to be love. And that word, that four-letter word, came up a few different times yesterday in the C-suite conversations, which is not often a word that you hear thrown about amidst C-suite executives from around the world. But I do think it captures the spirit of what this is all about. We read in the Aspen readings a couple years ago a Wendell Berry essay called "It All Turns on Affection." And I believe that's true, however impenetrable that essay was. To get through, I believe that the core message is spot on, that it all does turn on affection. And business is most often thought about as transactions, but this business community believes that relationships are at the center of that. And it's my relationship with all of you and the B Corps all around the world, inspired by your incredibly catalytic leadership, that has gotten me through some difficult times, and that I'm very confident are going to get all of us through some difficult times. And so I'm grateful for all of you. We are all grateful that you've created a platform for all of our leadership to manifest in the world. What you all have in your hands is a special Founder's Declaration of Interdependence. My dad's sort of letter of conscience to his peers is your equivalent of that is took the form of a Declaration of Interdependence that you were willing to sign and say, this is what we stand for, this is what we believe in. And so you're all holding a special Founder's Declaration of Interdependence with a short inscription to express our gratitude to you that we hope that you take back to your offices and share with your families and your communities, not so that you can brag, but so that you can feel appropriately proud for what you've helped create. And so I'd like to invite my partner and closest friend, Andrew and Bart, to read, I'll get in front of give you the mic, and to read that short inscription of gratitude to the founding B Corps.
So that inscription says, in 2007, you became a founding B Corporation. On that day and every day since, you've shown us the power we have in recognizing our interdependence, that we are all connected and that we can go further together. As we gather in Toronto in 2017 to celebrate the milestone of 10 years as a powerful B Corp community of practice, and to envision our next 10 years of servant leadership, of collective action, and of impact, we also gather to celebrate your leadership that has catalyzed this global movement. From all of us who have followed your lead, thank you.